So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. As you know, this webinar is about the NSF Pathways to Enable Open Source Ecosystems, or POSE program. So we'll kick off in just a second with opening remarks that will be given by Gracie Nacho. And following that, I'll provide an overview presentation regarding POSE and also covering some points about the upcoming submission deadline in September. And then we should have a fairly extended period, I think, for Q&A. So if you have questions, please submit your questions via the chat to any of the co-hosts in the drop-down menu that you see. We will not be using the raised hand option, so please remember to submit your questions via chat, as I say, to any of the co-hosts. And you can submit your questions during the presentation. They obviously won't be answered live during the presentation, but we might answer them via chat, or otherwise we may be able to answer them at the end. And we'll get to all the questions that we can today. If there are too many questions, we may just not be able to get to all of them. Okay, so it's my distinct pleasure now to introduce Gracie Nacho, who's going to be delivering some opening remarks for the webinar. Gracie is the National Science Foundation's Deputy Assistant Director for Technology, Innovation and Partnerships, helping to lead the newly established TIP Directorate. Prior to this, Gracie served as the Deputy Division Director and Acting Division Director for the then Division of Industrial Innovation and Partnerships within the NSF Directorate for Engineering, where she led policy development and programs that accelerate federally funded research into market opportunities. Under Gracie's leadership, NSF initiated a pre-submission pitch process for small businesses, providing more immediate feedback to early-stage startup companies. Gracie has been with NSF for nearly 3 decades, serving in a broad range of roles, spanning the development of the TIP Directorate, grants and agreements oversight, program management, and diversity and inclusion efforts. Gracie is known as a change agent for positive human capital reforms, business practice innovations, and NSF policy development. In recent years, Gracie's taken an agency leadership role in developing partnerships with industry, nonprofits, other federal agencies, and international organizations. So with that, I'd like to invite Gracie to deliver her opening remarks.
Thank you, Peter, and good afternoon, everyone. As you've heard, I'm Gracie Nacho, and I have the honor of serving as the Deputy Assistant Director for Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships. And it's a pleasure to welcome you to the webinar this afternoon. As many of you know, a little over a year ago, we at NSF launched a new directorate for technology, innovation, and partnerships. And this is NSF's first new directorate in 32 years. So it's been an exciting opportunity and truly a once-in-a-generation activity. So what's different or special about TIP? Well, our focus in this directorate is really threefold: to cultivate new innovation ecosystems across the U.S. that advance use-inspired research with a particular focus on breakthrough technologies and societal and economic challenges. Secondly, to enhance the translation of emerging technologies to the market and to society more broadly. And third, to leverage partnerships that bring researchers and practitioners together to develop the workforce of the future. Now, for the purposes of this webinar, let me drill a little bit into that second focus area around technology translation. As I'm sure you know, NSF has been a leader in taking research results from lab to market through programs that we pioneered for the rest of government, like the SBIR and STTR programs that we created back in 1977 and are now congressionally mandated at 10 other agencies. And the NSF I-Corps program that we launched about 11 years ago that has also expanded into agencies like the Department of Energy and NIH. But having said that, we now see an opportunity to provide avenues for additional pathways for the translational impact of the research that we and others fund. So it's no longer just about translating research results to startups, small businesses, and markets. But rather, you can imagine ways in which research results can inform new policies, such as wireless research that can inform policymaking by the FCC. Similarly, results from the education research that we support can be scaled, and those insights can be scaled to K through 12 and higher education. Now, another pathway is the one that takes an open source product to an open source ecosystem, and that's the subject of the Pathways to Enable Open Source Ecosystems, or the POSE program that we're describing today. Open source ecosystems are an important counterpoint to, but not a replacement of, more common for-profit companies and offer several key strengths. They're well suited to large multidisciplinary efforts aimed at solving large-scale problems. They engender a sense of ownership among all participants and encourage contributions from new technical disciplines as the open source ecosystem evolves. And they avoid costs, delays, and disputes that frequently arise in circumstances where proprietary solutions are developed. Open source ecosystems encourage rapid prototyping in moving value from the conception to execution phases, serving as important catalysts for innovation. A key aspect of successful open source ecosystems is their value in demonstrating the potential of a technology at scale in diverse application scenarios. While not always easy to quantify, the significant technological, societal, and economic impacts of open source ecosystems over the past decades are undeniable. For example, a European Commission study estimated that companies located in the European Union invested around 1 billion euros in open source software alone in 2018, which brought about a positive impact on the European economy of between 65 and 95 billion euros. So the POSE program was the first new program that was launched out of the new TIP Directorate back in March of 22, with the aim of catalyzing the creation and growth of impactful open source ecosystems of all types across all areas of science and engineering. This program is not intended to focus only on open source software. The basic thesis underpinning POSE is that the early and intentional creation of organizations to manage the growth of open source ecosystems will help ensure that critical issues such as safety, security, privacy, and supply chain reliability are baked in from the start, thereby helping to avoid damaging open source breaches that have been seen in recent years. So we expect to see all of those things in your proposals. So now we've completed a phase 1 proposal cycle for planning projects and are in the final stages of evaluating a cycle of phase 2 proposals for open source ecosystem creation and growth. The proposals that we've received to date confirm an interest in open source ecosystems of all types, software, hardware, and data, and in technical and application areas spanning all of the research directorates here at NSF. For example, the phase 1 proposal cycle resulted in 25 awards that could be broadly categorized into the fields of computing infrastructure, climate and clean energy, robotics and hardware, data, scientific use cases, software, and education. It has also been encouraging to see strong interest from both academic and non-academic communities. Since POSE was launched, we have also received important confirmation from various sectors of the open source world that POSE is a timely and important initiative. This is significant since the impact of open source on the national and global economy and on society generally is increasing, as are the risks associated with poorly designed or maintained open source products. So our long-term vision is to create a culture in which open source ecosystems combine the unique and compelling strengths of open source with the infrastructure advantages most commonly seen today in for-profit enterprises. Now, before I close, let me extend my gratitude to the POSE Program Director Working Group for their time, for their passion, as well as for their tremendous commitment and dedication to this program. With that, thank you all again for tuning in. Your interest in the POSE program is key to its long-term success, and we look forward to receiving your ideas in the form of proposals. Peter, thanks again, and back to you.
Hi, Peter. I think it looks like you're muted.
Thank you. Thank you, Gracie. Really appreciate that. So we'll transition now to the presentation portion of the webinar. This will take probably about 30 minutes, and then after that, we'll open it up to Q&A. So I want to begin by reminding everyone of the vision of the POSE program. So the vision of the program is to harness the power of distributed open source development as an engine of innovation to address challenges of national and societal importance. So I guess the first question to ask is, what do we mean by open source, at least in the context of POSE? So open source refers to something that people can modify and share because its design is publicly accessible. It might be software source code, which is probably the most common example. Could be languages or formats, could be hardware instruction sets, hardware designs or specifications, could be scientific methodologies, models or processes. It could be manufacturing processes or process specifications. Could be material formulations, could be data, could be other things. The key point I want to make here is that POSE includes open source of all types. It is not limited to, for example, open source software, which is probably the most common example. It's not limited to any particular type of open source. It's open to all types of open source. So just by way of background, I think we're all familiar with how open source products emerge. A typical example would be a researcher or maybe a small group of researchers who develop an open source product for their own use and make it available to others. And it might be used by some other external users, probably in a similar technology space or research space to the originating team. In some cases, open source products become very widely used and very impactful. And when this happens, there's a need to wrap some processes around the open source product and some structure around the ecosystem that develops. And this might include, for example, building a developer community, creating a mechanism for distributed development, dealing with bugs and defects, dealing with security issues, understanding the end user communities that the open source product will be interfacing to, and possibly building an organization that actually runs all of this, manages all of this, in which case there'll be a need for some governance model to be developed and some managing documentation also to be developed. So this is an example of a transition from an open source product to an open source ecosystem, and this is exactly what POSE is intended to catalyze. And we'll come back to this in more detail shortly. So this slide just is intended to highlight the differences between an open source product and an open source ecosystem. And you can see there are some similarities in these first two bullet points. Original source code is available online. There are some external users. In the case of an open source product, though, all the development and updates is generally done by the originating team. There's not usually an external developer community, and there's fairly minimal support for users. In the case of an open source ecosystem, on the other hand, there are typically external contributors to the open source, to the ongoing development of the open source product. And there are onboarding mechanisms to bring additional contributors on board into the open source ecosystem, into the developer community particularly. There's usually, in the case of an open source ecosystem, there's usually comprehensive user support, and there are usually in place mechanisms for continuous integration, delivery, and deployment with security, privacy, and quality control mechanisms all in place. So these are sort of some of the contrasts between an open source product and an open source ecosystem. So as I said, POSE is intended to catalyze the transition from an open source product to an open source ecosystem. But more particularly, it's intended to enable the early and intentional transition of an open source product to an open source ecosystem. And the reason we want to do this early and intentionally is we want to bake in all of the features that I mentioned a moment ago, like security, privacy, et cetera, bake them in at the start, as Gracie mentioned in her opening remarks, because we believe that's going to result in a safer, more secure, more reliable open source ecosystem. And so the way POSE works is it does this by funding the creation and operation of a POSE managing organization. This is the organization that I alluded to just a slide or two ago. So this slide is a schematic representation of a POSE open source ecosystem. And you can see it's broken down into three categories, if you like. On the left are the intellectual content developers. These could be folks in academia. It could be individuals or teams in nonprofit organizations, in industry. And of course, there could be international developers involved as well. In the middle here is the POSE managing organization. I'll come back to that in just a moment. But the POSE managing organization also interfaces to downstream entities. So it will interface to the end user communities. Again, these may be in academia, they might be in government, they might be in industry, they might be international. And it will also, the managing organization will also interface to other drivers of this open source ecosystem. This could be vendors, for example, it could be funding vehicles, it could be standards organizations, and so on. So back to the managing organization. So this organization will be responsible for making sure that the whole machine works, basically. So it will be responsible, for example, for administrative, legal, and governance functions. It will be responsible for end user discovery and outreach to the end user communities. It'll be responsible for content development, for onboarding developers, for testing and evaluation, for security and privacy, and most importantly, for sustainability. So POSE open source ecosystems, while they're initially supported by NSF, ultimately they have to become sustainable in their own right. Now, one important point that I want to make here is that POSE funding is intended to catalyze the development of this managing organization. So the POSE money is injected here at the managing organization stage. Okay, so I want to briefly discuss what POSE is, and then in the next slide, what POSE is not. So the POSE program, as I've been saying, is intended to fund managing organizations to catalyze the creation of open source ecosystems based on an existing mature open source product. Now, when looking at a POSE open source ecosystem, there are a number of key considerations to keep in mind. First is broader impact. So a POSE open source ecosystem, as I said right back at the start in the vision statement, should address significant challenges of societal, national, or economic importance. The POSE open source ecosystem should also be based, as I mentioned just above here, on a mature open source product. So what do we mean by mature? We mean an open source product that has active users outside of the originating team or the originating institutions. So the fact that it has active users outside of the originating team indicates that other people actually are interested in using this open source product. So that's a positive sign for building an open source ecosystem. Another consideration is whether an open source ecosystem is actually the right approach to maximize the impact of an open source product. I mean, an open source ecosystem is not the only way to go. You might, for example, instead, build a for-profit or create a for-profit startup company. Maybe in some cases, that's a more efficient way to do it. The objective here with POSE is to try to get to impact as efficiently as possible, while also maintaining a safe and secure and welcoming open source ecosystem. So an important question to ask is whether an OSE is actually the right approach, the optimal approach. And the other consideration to keep in mind is NSF's objectives here. So our objective is to apply public funds where they will be most impactful, where they'll be catalytic in creating or growing new and impactful open source ecosystems. So because they're public funds, we want the benefits to accrue to the public in some way, shape, or form, and we want to apply money where it will move the needle the most, where it'll make the maximum difference. So that was what POSE is. This is about what POSE is not. So POSE is not intended to fund the development of open source products. So if you go back a couple of slides, you'll see here, as I said, the POSE funding goes to the managing organization. It is not intended to go upstream to fund the further development of the open source product or to fund new open source products. We're assuming that is done by other mechanisms. There are plenty of funding mechanisms for that. So it's not intended to fund the development of open source products. As I mentioned, the POSE funding should be catalytic. It should move the needle for the open source ecosystem. And therefore, POSE is not really intended to fund existing well-resourced open source communities and ecosystems. The rationale simply being that the money that we would provide wouldn't make a big difference to those open source communities and ecosystems. So it would not be public money well spent. And thirdly, POSE is not intended to support open source ventures for which profit is the primary motive. Obviously, you can go and form a for-profit organization if profit is the primary motive. Our primary motivation here at the end of the day is societal and national impact. And so obviously an open source ecosystem has to be sustainable. It has to find a way to sustain itself, but profit should not be the primary motive. Okay, so you would have noticed in the slide above, we talked about, and I've mentioned a couple of times, I think, external intellectual content developers. And I want to try and explain why we regard this constituency in the developer community as so important. So this illustration at the bottom is intended to show all the possible use cases for a particular open source product. So it's a universe of possible use cases, kind of like phase space, if you like. And you can see here we have an open source product, and the green dot indicates its original use case is positioned here in the universe of all possible use cases. One of the strengths of external developers is they can bring an awareness of new potential use cases to this open source product, and thereby effectively extend the vision of the open source ecosystem by just raising awareness of the fact that there are new use cases out there for this open source product, which the originating team may not have thought about at all because it's not in a space that they operate in. So the other strength of these intellectual content developers is that they can actually create solutions for these new use cases in these different application areas. So these new use cases will have somewhat different requirements. They'll require the open source product, probably require the open source product to be modified somewhat to meet the requirements of each of these different new use cases. And what we have seen in our discussions with people who've been instrumental in establishing open source ecosystems that have gone on to be highly impactful is that in many cases, these new use cases actually will unearth some very, very new, unexpected, and highly impactful directions for the open source product. And in fact, they may become the focus of the open source ecosystem ultimately. That's actually very common. It's like for-profit companies pivoting early in their life. Often they pivot. Even large companies now, if you go back and look at their origins, they typically have made major pivots 3 or 4 times to get to the product market fit that ultimately was the best for them. This is kind of the equivalent process happening here. And so that's why we regard the presence of external intellectual content developers in the developer community as so important, because they can enable this mechanism. And we believe that this is a mechanism that can that can result in a faster route to impact for the open source product. So another word about external developers. So we recognize that the world is not black and white, it's shades of gray. And so some open source products, this is stating the obvious, but some open source products will have very highly sensitive core intellectual property. And so we recognize that in some cases, this core IP may only be opened up to certain developers, certain trusted developers, trusted by the originating team for the open source product. On the other hand, if you have layers of intellectual content contributions, as is shown here, so red is the most sensitive, yellow is a bit less sensitive, green is the least sensitive, then you can open up the IP to a greater number, a greater proportion of the developers in the developer community. And so we do anticipate that this kind of situation will arise, particularly with security-focused open source products. So that's just a note to indicate that we recognize it's not always black and white, that a developer community may not be homogeneous. There might be different levels of developers in this developer community. But still, the mechanism that I indicated in the previous slide still holds. Okay, so let's switch gears now and talk about the program a little bit. So as you probably know, there are 2 types of POSE awards, Phase 1 awards and Phase 2 awards. So Phase 1 awards are scoping and planning awards, and Phase 2 awards are what we call establishment and expansion awards. So awards where projects where you actually are building something. So applicants can apply for one or other of these awards, but not for both for the same project. So you can't submit basically the same idea to Phase 1 and Phase 2 at the same time. And I should note that Phase 1 is not a prerequisite for Phase 2. So if you feel that you don't need a scoping and planning award, then you can apply directly to Phase 2. And in our recent Phase 2 cycle, a lot of the Phase 2 applicants did not go through Phase 1 actually. So I'll just speak very quickly about the phase 1 and phase 2 projects. All of this is covered in more detail in the solicitation, so I don't want to spend too much time on this slide and the next slide. So phase 1 projects, as I mentioned, are scoping and planning projects. So a phase 1 proposal should address planning aspects of ecosystem discovery, organization and governance models, and community building. As I say, it's planning aspects. You're not necessarily building anything at this stage in phase 1, but you should be planning it. A phase 1 proposal includes an up to 7-page project description. This page number does not include letters of support, letters of collaboration, or the data management plan. Maximum funding at phase 1 is $300,000, and the duration of phase 1 is up to 12 months. Now, in the case of phase 2, these are, as I said before, these are establishment and expansion projects. So here you're actually building something. You're doing something, impacting the real world. And so a phase 2 proposal should address ecosystem establishment and growth, organization and governance. I mean, I mentioned that in the context of phase 1, but here you should actually be, not just planning it, you're actually deploying it. Should address a continuous development model. It should address community building. And importantly, it should address in detail sustainability. So there should be clear sustainability goals and an actionable evaluation plan towards those sustainability goals with clear success metrics. So a phase 2 proposal, the project description is up to 15 pages. Again, it doesn't include the elements that I mentioned in relation to phase 1. Maximum funding at phase 2 is $1.5 million, and the nominal duration is 2 years. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that POSE funding should not be used for developing open source products. However, POSE funding can be used for some types of development. So it can be used to fund the development of open source infrastructure. So this might, for example, be, continuous development, integration and deployment methodologies. It might be testing and verification methods. It might be security and privacy, or it might be other quality control processes. So that's still development work. It's not research work necessarily, but it's development work. And that is very much in scope for phase 2. So you can do development work in phase 2. But again, POSE funding should not be used to fund developers to create or improve an open source product. But one little aside here, or maybe a caveat, is in some cases we recognize that an open source product might have to be modified to interface to certain infrastructure that's being built for the open source ecosystem. So that type of modification of an open source product to allow it to interface properly to the OSE infrastructure, that is actually in scope for POSE funding. Now, all proposals must include a data management plan that must describe mechanisms to ensure the following aspects where they are relevant. We realize that not each of these considerations will be equally relevant to all proposals, but where they are relevant, there should be mechanisms to ensure the following things described in the data management plan. So these include code and data quality. They include security considerations. This might, for example, be access control mechanisms for users and content contributors. It could be secure software development methodologies. Could be policies for patching known security vulnerabilities. It could be chain of custody issues. And thirdly, mechanisms, the data management plan must include mechanisms to ensure ethical use of sensitive data. This is really critically important. So this covers things like privacy and protection of human subjects. That is absolutely critical that be taken into account. And again, that will be of greater or lesser importance depending on the nature of the project. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about eligibility and fit for the POSE program. So proposals can be submitted to POSE by the following entities. Firstly, U.S. institutions of higher education. Next, non-profit, non-academic U.S. organizations. Thirdly, for-profit U.S. organizations. And fourthly, certain branches within US state and local governments. Now, non-profit, so I want to point out there are some things that I'm about to go through in this slide and the following slides, which are different from the previous solicitation. So it's very important to understand these differences. So certain things have been tightened up. So please, and this is all covered in detail in the solicitation, but please take note of these. So non-profit and for-profit proposing organizations must be US-based and US-owned and controlled. And you can see the solicitation for definitions of what we mean by US-based and US-owned and controlled. There are detailed definitions in there. So again, please read the solicitation for further information about this. POSE proposals can be multi-organizational, but a single organization must serve as the lead, and all other organizations must be on the proposal as sub-awardees. And again, just a reminder, projects that are not based on distributed ongoing development of a mature open source product will not be a good fit with the POSE program. So just please keep that in mind. Now, there are also different conditions around who may serve as the principal investigator from the previous solicitation. So I won't read through all of this, but please do make sure that you are familiar with this. So for institutions of higher education, by the submission deadline, any PI, co-PI, or other senior project personnel must hold either a tenured or tenure-track position or a primary full-time paid appointment in a research or teaching position at a US-based campus of an institution of higher education. And then there are some statements further down here about other folks who are not eligible, and a statement here about individuals with primary appointments at non-US based, non-profit or non-US based for-profit organizations are not eligible. Now, in terms of all other eligible proposing organizations, the PI must be an employee of the proposing organization who is normally resident in the US and must be acting as an employee of the proposing organization while performing principal investigator responsibilities. PI may perform PI responsibilities while temporarily out of the US, for example, if you're traveling to a conference or something like that. But if you're living outside the US for, say, 9 months of a 12-month project, that's not going to work. So please do be aware of these changes to some of the conditions. Now, international contributors and collaborators. So international contributors, in the contributor community to the ongoing development of an open source product are expected and encouraged in the POSE program. International collaborators, that is to say organizations that collaborate with a POSE managing organization, are encouraged but cannot be funded via a POSE award. So the extension of this is that international subawards or subcontracts cannot be funded via POSE, in which case you wouldn't include them in the proposal. But it's important to appreciate that. Now, there are also, there's much more thorough guidance about budget preparation in the current solicitation than in the previous solicitation. I'm not going to go through it because we'd be here for a couple of hours just with that. But this, when this presentation is made available, this is actually a link to the appropriate section in the solicitation, and you can go through these budget requirements yourself. So please do be sure to adhere to these requirements. If the budget is not compliant, then it'll either be corrected in post-panel diligence, or if your proposal is being considered for award and has gone to the Division of Grants and Agreements and there are any further concerns, the budget will be brought back into compliance with these conditions. So it's best just to be aware of them up front and make sure that the budget is compliant in the first place. Okay, so how do you apply to POSE? Detailed instructions, of course, are in the solicitation, which is linked at the first bullet point here. The submission deadline, which is, so you have to submit via research.gov, as you know. Submission deadline for phase 1 and phase 2. So this cycle is a combined phase 1 and phase 2 cycle. Submission deadline is September 7th, 2023, so a bit over a month away. And proposals must be submitted by 5 p.m. submitters local time. And the reason I highlighted this is because it's important to appreciate that the submitter is the organization on the cover page of the proposal. Last cycle we had, and I've seen this in other programs too, we had some confusion where an organization was based on the East Coast, but the person actually pressing the submission button was on the West Coast, and they thought they had 3 more hours than they did actually have to submit the proposal. So It's the local time for the submitting organization. So proposals will be reviewed by external experts. The review criteria are included in the solicitation. I would strongly encourage you to read the review criteria and understand what they mean. And we do aim to provide the outcomes of the review process within 6 months of the submission deadline. If you have further questions, first place to go actually is the solicitation. It may not be fun reading, but it's densely packed with information, and a lot of questions actually answered there in the solicitation. We do also have an FAQ, a POSE FAQ, which is linked here. It's a relatively new FAQ, so we will be growing this over time, this FAQ over time, but some of the more basic questions are probably answered there. And then we plan to hold an office hours session in August, where you'll be welcome to answer any further questions that you have. We haven't set the date for that yet, but that will be announced fairly soon. So that's basically it from me. Before I stop talking, I want to echo something that Gracie said, and that is that although I'm doing the talking right now, all the work has been done by this incredible team of the POSE working group, this team of people who are totally committed to this program and have really pulled all the heavy oars. So if you want to thank anyone for the POSE program, thank the whole working group, because everyone has put in a huge amount of time and effort and passion to make this program what it is now, and hopefully it will continue to grow strongly in the coming years. So just a reminder, we're going to transition now to the Q&A. Just a reminder, please submit your questions via chat to any of the co-hosts. We're not going to be using the raised hand option, so just submit your questions via chat to any of the co-hosts. So with that, I am going to stop talking and we will transition to the Q&A session.